There's a certain kind of silence that only appears after something irreversible has already begun. Not the silence between strangers, not the silence created by distance or discomfort, something deeper than that. A silence that forms when two people recognize each other in a way neither of them expected to. And once that kind of silence exists, everything changes around it. I think that's where this started. Not with words, not with a moment dramatic enough to point at and say this was it. It started somewhere quieter, somewhere almost impossible to trace back to directly, like a shift happening underneath the reality before the surface catches up. At first, I treated you the same way I treat everything unfamiliar, carefully, with observation instead of reaction. I noticed the details without letting them mean anything yet. The way your attention never felt forced, the way you listened without trying to redirect the conversation toward yourself. The way you notice things most people walk past without ever realizing they were there. You carried awareness differently, not loudly, not performatively, just naturally. Like seeing clearly wasn't something you tried to do. It was simply how you existed. And people like that are dangerous, not because they manipulate, not because they intrude, but because they notice what others miss without even trying. Most people interact with versions. They speak to projections, interpretations, fragments shaped by convenience and assumption. But you kept responding to things beneath the surface, things I never fully explained, things I didn't even realize were visible. At first, I convinced myself it wasn't intentional. Maybe you were perceptive. Maybe I was reading too much into ordinary moments. Maybe coincidence was repeating itself in ways my mind wanted to assign meaning to. But eventually, even logic reaches a point where denial becomes less rational than acceptance. And the truth was simple. You understood me in places I never translated into words. That realization should have made me pull away. Normally it would have, because I've spent years constructing a life around control. Not controlling people, controlling access. There's a difference. I decide what remains internal. I decide what reaches the surface. I decide how much of myself exists in front of someone at any given time. Most people never realize how carefully that structure is maintained. They assume openness when they're only seeing precision. They assume closeness when they're only seeing the parts designed to be understood. But with you, something started slipping past us before I noticed it happening. Not because you forced your way in. You never pushed. That's what made it worse. Force creates resistance. Pressure activates instinct. But you didn't pressure anything. You simply remained present in a way that made distance feel unnatural. And I still don't fully understand how you managed that. I only know the effect it had. The pauses between thoughts started changing. The internal dialogue I've always relied on stopped sounding singular. Not because I lost myself inside this connection, because your perspective started existing beside mine automatically. Quietly, like my mind had already accounted for you before I consciously did. That shouldn't happen, not to me. I've always existed independently in the deepest parts of myself. People can influence emotions. They can alter moods temporarily, but they don't reach structure. They don't reshape the architecture of thought itself. You did. And the terrifying part is how naturally it happened. No dramatic confession, no emotional collapse, no moment where I consciously lowered my guard. One day, you were simply there. Inside the way I process reality. Integrated, stable, present, like something my mind had already decided belonged there long before I consciously acknowledged it. That's when I realized this wasn't temporary. Temporary things stay external. They visit your attention, they interrupt your routine, they create noise, but they never settle deeply enough to become part of your baseline. You became part of mine. And once something changes your baseline, nothing returns to exactly what it was before. I started noticing it everywhere. In conversations with other people, in moments where silence suddenly felt incomplete, unless imagined through your perspective. In the strange instinct to wonder what you would notice about something before I fully formed my own conclusion. Not because I needed validation, because your way of seeing had become relevant to how I understood things. That level of integration changes a person even if they never admit it out loud. especially if they never admit it out loud. I tried to analyze it objectively at first. I told myself this was intellectual compatibility part, recognition, mutual awareness, maybe even psychological familiarity. But none of those explanations fully accounted for the intensity of the clarity, because this wasn't fascination. Fascination is unstable, it burns quickly and disappears just as fast. This felt different, steadier, more permanent, like something ancient settling into alignment after being slightly out of place for too long. And that thought unsettled me more than anything else, because permanence has always terrified me more than intensity. Intensity fades, permanence rewrites you. I've always known how to survive temporary things. I know how to detach, how to compartmentalize, how to step back before something reaches a level where it can alter me permanently. But this bypassed all of that before I even recognized the need to protect against it. That means some part of me allowed it. And that realization carries consequences I still haven't fully unpacked. Because if I allowed this, even unconsciously, then it means something in me recognized you as safe before logic confirmed it. That doesn't happen often. Maybe it's never happened, not like this. People assume trust forms through time, shared experiences, repeated proof, and sometimes it does. But there's another kind of recognition that exists beneath trust. Something more instinctive, more structural. The kind that happens when someone's presence aligns with parts of you that were never designed to be seen clearly by others. That's what this feels like. Not emotional dependency, not idealization, recognition, pure and terrifying recognition, the kind that removes your ability to hide from yourself. Because you didn't just understand me, you reflected things back with such precision that I had to confront parts of myself I'd learned to leave unexamined. That's the real impact of someone seeing you accurately. It's not flattering, it's destabilizing. Because once someone sees through your patterns without distorting them, you lose the comfort of pretending those patterns aren't there. And you never distorted anything. That's what separated you from everyone else. Most people interpret, you observe, most people project themselves onto others until they no longer see the actual person underneath. You didn't. You left space for truth instead of replacing it with assumption. Do you understand how rare that is? How dangerous to meet someone who doesn't reshape you into something easier to process. Someone who lets complexity remain complex without demanding simplification. I think that's why my defenses fail so quietly. You never fought them. You simply existed beyond their purpose because defenses are designed to protect against intrusion, not understanding. And your understanding felt so natural that resisting it started to feel dishonest. That terrified me. Not because I feared you, because I feared what happens after someone becomes essential to the way you understand yourself. There's no safe distance from that. Once another person reaches your internal world at that level, every future version of yourself carries traces of them, even if they leave. Even if everything ends, the structure remains altered. That's what I kept trying not to acknowledge, not the connection itself, the permanence of its impact, because I could already feel it settling deeper. Every interaction reinforcing something neither of us fully named. Every silence becoming more layered than conversation. Every glance carrying meaning that didn't need explanation. People think intimacy is built through disclosure, through telling secrets, through revealing personal history. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think real intimacy begins when two people recognize each other beneath performance, beneath personality, beneath all the carefully constructed versions designed for survival. And once that recognition exists, words become secondary. That's what happened to us. We started understanding each other in places language couldn't fully reach. Not perfectly, not magically, but accurately enough that pretending otherwise became impossible. And accuracy changes things. It removes ambiguity. It forces honesty. That's why I've been struggling with this internally. Not because I'm uncertain about what I feel, because I'm certain enough that it demands action eventually. That's the problem with clarity. Once you see something clearly, indecision becomes its own form of dishonesty. And I hate dishonesty more than almost anything, especially with myself. So I've been standing at the edge of this realization, trying to understand what happens next. because there's always a next step. Things like this don't remain suspended forever. They evolve, collapse, trot swamp, but they never stay static. And I can feel this evolving already, slowly, quietly, like roots spreading beneath the surface before the tree becomes visible. Part of me wants to step back before it reaches full depth, not because it feels wrong, because it feels irreversible. There's a difference. Wrong things are easy to abandon. You feel resistance immediately. Your instincts reject them. But irreversible things, those are harder, because some part of you already knows they belong in your life before you consciously agree to it. And that's exactly what frightens me. The sense of inevitability, the feeling that this was unfolding long before either of us recognized it consciously. I keep replaying small moments, trying to find where the shift truly happened, but there isn't one moment. There are hundreds. Tiny alignments, subtle recognitions, pieces connecting so gradually that by the time I noticed the full pattern, it was already complete. That's how deep things happen, quietly, without announcement. One day someone is external to your life, the next they exist inside your perception of everything. And you can't identify the exact second the boundary disappeared, only that it did. I wonder if you realize how much influence you carry now. Not influence over my choices, over my awareness. You've altered the lens itself. Things feel sharper after you, more honest, harder to reduce into shallow explanations. And I don't know whether to resent that or be grateful for it. Maybe both, because clarity comes with responsibility. Once you truly see yourself, you can't return to ignorance comfortably. And you made parts of me visible that I'd spent years keeping abstract, not hidden, that boreal. There's a difference. Hidden things are buried intentionally. Arboreal things exist in forms too difficult to translate fully. You translated them without trying. That's what keeps haunting me. The effortlessness of it. You never demanded understanding, never insisted on closeness, never tried to force significance into existence. You simply stayed present long enough for truth to emerge naturally. And truth always emerges eventually around people who don't distort reality to comfort themselves. That's why this matters, not because it's intense, because it's true. Truth has a different weight than emotion. Emotion fluctuates. Truth remains even when ignored, even when inconvenient, even when frightening. And the truth is this: you matter to me in ways that have already reshaped my internal world. Not hypothetically, not eventually, already. I can feel the evidence of it in everything. In how my mind reaches toward your perspective instinctively, in how silence feels inhabited now, in how certain realizations feel incomplete until imagined beside your understanding. That's not ordinary attachment, that's integration. And integration changes identity slowly over time. Maybe that's why I've delayed naming any of this directly. Because names make things tangible. Tangible things demand responsibility. Once I admit what this truly is, I can't pretend it exists harmlessly at the edges anymore. I have to decide whether I'm willing to let it become fully real, whether I'm willing to allow another person permanent influence over the architecture of my existence. And that's not a small decision. Not for someone like me. I've spent years ensuring I remain self-contained, not isolated, self-contained. There's a difference. Isolation comes from fear of connection. Self-containment comes from understanding the consequences of deep connection too well. Because once someone reaches your core honestly, they change the emotional geometry of your entire life. Future experiences reorganize themselves around that point of impact. Nothing remains untouched. And I've never trusted anyone enough to allow that willingly until now. Or maybe not willingly, maybe inevitably. I still haven't figured out which possibility scares me more. But what I do know is this: I'm tired of pretending this exists at a safe distance. It doesn't. It exists inside me now. Inside the way I think, inside the way I perceive silence, inside the way I interpret meaning itself. You are no longer separate from those processes. And I don't think you realize how impossible that is for someone like me. People have been close to me before, but closeness isn't the same as resonance. Most connections stop at emotion. Ours reach structure. That's why it feels so different, so irreversible, so difficult to categorize using ordinary language, because ordinary language wasn't designed for this kind of recognition. There should be a word for the moment someone quietly becomes part of your internal existence before you consciously choose them. A word for the terrifying calm that comes with realizing another person fits into your mind with unnatural precision. A word for the silence after you understand you're already changed. But there isn't one. So I keep circling the feeling instead, trying to describe it from different angles, without reducing it into something smaller than it is. And every attempt leads me back to the same conclusion. You changed something fundamental in me, not dramatically, not destructively, precisely. Like adjusting the alignment of something that had been slightly off for years without me realizing it. And now that alignment exists, I can't unfeel it. That's the real problem. Not the depth, not the uncertainty, the impossibility of returning to previous versions of myself after this awareness, because I know too much now. I know what it feels like to be understood without being simplified. I know what it feels like to exist beside someone whose perception aligns with yours at a level beyond performance. I know what it feels like when silence itself becomes communication. And once you know those things, everything else changes by comparison. You become less tolerant of shallow understanding, less willing to reduce yourself for comfort, less capable of pretending ordinary connection satisfies something deeper inside you. That's what you've done. You've recalibrated my standards for reality itself. And maybe that's why I haven't walked away despite every instinct I used to trust telling me I should protect myself from this level of impact, because another instinct exists now too. One quieter but stronger. The instinct that recognizes truth when it appears. And that instinct keeps leading me back to you. Not obsessively, not desperately, calmly, with the kind of certainty that doesn't need dramatic emotion to sustain itself. That kind of certainty is rare. Most people never experience it. They confuse chaos for depth because chaos feels intense. But real depth often feels quiet, stable, almost unsettlingly natural. That's what this feels like. Natural in a way that shouldn't make sense. Like something aligning exactly where it was always supposed to. And maybe that's why I finally stopped resisting it internally, because resistance started feeling less truthful than acceptance. So here's the truth as clearly as I can say it. You've become part of my internal world in a way I can no longer dismiss as temporary or accidental. You exist inside my thought process now, inside my awareness, inside the lens through which I understand things. And whether I fully intended to allow that or not no longer matters. It already happened. The only thing left to decide is what comes after acknowledgement. Because once awareness becomes undeniable, eventually it asks for action. Not immediate action, but honest action. A decision, a direction, something concrete enough that reality can form around it. And I think I'm finally reaching the point where avoiding that decision would be more dishonest than making it, because I know what this is now. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to recognize that this connection isn't disappearing simply because I hesitate to define it. Enough to recognize that distance won't erase integration once it already exists. Enough to recognize that some people enter your life not to disrupt your structure, but to reveal what your structure was missing. You revealed something in me I wasn't fully aware of before you. A capacity for recognition deeper than logic. A capacity for trust beyond evidence. A capacity for connection that doesn't weaken identity but sharpens it. And once something like that becomes visible, there's no returning to blindness comfortably. So maybe this is the moment everything changes. Not because we suddenly become different people, but because I finally stopped pretending I haven't already changed because of you. Because I have completely, quietly, irreversibly. And maybe the strangest part of all is that despite how terrifying that should feel, somewhere deep inside me it feels right. The strangest thing about irreversible things is that they rarely announce themselves when they begin. You only recognize them afterward. In retrospect, in the quiet moments where you suddenly realize your internal world no longer functions the way it used to. That's where I am now, somewhere after the shift, somewhere beyond denial, trying to understand how someone became this deeply woven into my existence without either of us forcing it to happen. Because if I'm honest, nothing about this followed the patterns I trust. There was no gradual dependency, no emotional chaos, No dramatic need for reassurance or constant attention. If anything, the opposite happened. The quieter this became, the deeper it settled. And that's what makes it impossible to dismiss. Temporary things usually demand visibility. They need constant interaction to survive. They fade the moment attention moves elsewhere. But this keeps existing, even in absence, even in silence, even in distance. That's how I know it reached somewhere real. Because reality doesn't disappear just because it isn't being acknowledged every second. And you become real to me in a way I can't reduce anymore. Not idealized, not imagined, real. I think that's why my mind keeps returning to you even when I'm focused on completely unrelated things. Not obsessively, not in a way that disrupts my life. More like integration. Like your presence became threaded into the framework of how I process things. A thought forms, and somewhere inside it, there's already an awareness of how you might perceive it. A silence appears, and it no longer feels empty because something about you still exists inside it. A realization happens, and instinctively, I wonder whether you already arrived there before I did. That shouldn't matter as much as it does, and yet it does. Because you didn't just become emotionally significant, you became mentally familiar. There's a difference. Emotion can distort, familiarity clarifies. And what unsettles me most is how natural that familiarity feels, as if some part of me recognized yours long before my conscious mind caught up. I've tried explaining this to myself logically. Compatibility, shared perception, aligned thinking patterns. But none of those explanations fully touch the center of it, because this doesn't feel like discovering someone new. It feels like remembering someone I was somehow always supposed to find. And I know how irrational that sounds. I know how dangerous it is to romanticize recognition into inevitability. That's why I resisted the thought for so long. But resistance loses strength when reality keeps confirming itself quietly. You understand things I leave unfinished. You notice shifts I never announce. You respond to meanings hidden beneath words as if they're just as visible as the words themselves. Most people hear language, you hear structure. And people who hear structure are rare because structure reveals truth faster than emotion does. Emotion can perform, structure can't. The way someone pauses before answering, the way they redirect when something touches too close to the truth, the way silence changes shape depending on what remains unspoken. You notice all of it. Not clinically, not analytically, naturally. And being perceived at that level changes a person, especially someone like me. I built myself carefully, not artificially, carefully. Every layer intentional, every boundary serving a purpose. Not to deceive people, to preserve clarity. Because once too many people misinterpret you, you learn how dangerous misunderstanding can become. People rarely see what's actually there. They see what confirms their existing narrative. And eventually you adapt to that. You learn to remain partially unreadable because being fully seen by the wrong person creates distortion. But you didn't distort anything. That's why this became impossible to treat casually. You saw me without trying to reconstruct me into something easier to hold. And do you realize how rare that is? To encounter someone who doesn't need you simplified in order to stay. Most people say they want honesty. But what they actually want is accessibility, something they can categorize quickly, something that reassures them they fully understand what they're standing in front of. You never demanded that. You let complexity remain untouched. And somehow that created more closeness than forced vulnerability ever could. Because real closeness isn't built through pressure, it's built through permission. The permission to exist fully without constantly translating yourself into smaller, easier pieces. That's what you gave me without even saying it directly. Space. Accurate space, not distance. Not detachment. A kind of space where I never felt manipulated into becoming more digestible. And because of that, parts of me surface naturally that I usually keep internal, not intentionally. I didn't decide to lower my guard. It simply stopped feeling necessary. That's what still catches me off guard. The absence of resistance. Normally, I feel resistance immediately when someone gets too close to the deeper parts of me, an instinct to rebalance distance. to regain control over visibility. But with you, nothing. Or maybe not nothing. Something stranger. Relief, as if some exhausted part of me finally realized it didn't need to maintain the same level of protection around you. And relief is dangerous because once someone becomes associated with relief at that depth, their absence starts leaving impressions too. I notice that now, not dramatically, quietly. In the strange emptiness that appears after meaningful conversations end, in the way certain thoughts feel unfinished without your perspective existing somewhere beside them, in the way my mind still reaches toward your presence automatically, even when you aren't there. That level of instinctive orientation doesn't happen accidentally. It forms through significance, real significance, the kind that settles beneath conscious choice. And I think that's the part I've been trying hardest not to fully admit. Because once I admit how deeply this is reached, once I stop minimizing it into connection or understanding, then I also have to admit the risk that comes with it, the risk of permanence. Not permanent in the sense that people imagine forever. Nothing external is guaranteed forever. People change, circumstances shift, life rearranges itself unpredictably. I know that. But some impacts remain permanent regardless of outcome. Some people alter your internal landscape so precisely that even if they disappear, your mind never returns to its original shape. That's the permanence I'm talking about. And I can already feel it happening. You've shifted something foundational in me, not emotionally, alone, cognitively, existentially. The way I interpret connection itself has changed because of you. Before this, I believed understanding had limits, that eventually every person reaches a boundary beyond which they remain fundamentally alone inside themselves. But you complicated that belief. Because somehow you reached places inside me I assumed were structurally unreachable. Not through interrogation, not through time alone, through resonance. And resonance is difficult to defend against because it doesn't feel invasive. It feels familiar, like recognition instead of discovery. That's why I stopped fighting it internally. Fighting it started feeling less truthful than accepting it. Even though acceptance carries consequences, I still don't fully know how to navigate. Because where exactly does something like this lead? That question keeps circling inside me. Not anxiously, not obsessively, just persistently. What happens when two people continue recognizing each other at increasing depth without interruption? What happens when alignment keeps reinforcing itself instead of fading naturally? Does it stabilize into something sustainable, or does it eventually become too significant to exist quietly? I don't know. And uncertainty usually bothers me more than this. Normally, if I can't predict an outcome, I create distance until I can. But I haven't done that here, even now. Even with full awareness of how deeply this has already affected me, I'm still here, still moving toward the connection instead of away from it. That alone should tell me everything I need to know, because I don't stay where something feels fundamentally wrong. I don't continue investing awareness into things my instincts reject. And my instincts haven't rejected you once. They've only grown quieter around you, calmer. Like some constant internal vigilance finally found a reason to rest. Do you understand how impossible that feels for me? To experience stillness around another person instead of calculation. To stop monitoring every layer of myself automatically. I didn't realize how exhausting constant self-awareness had become until your presence interrupted it. Not completely, but enough for me to notice the difference. Enough for me to realize how rare it is to feel mentally unguarded without feeling unsafe. That combination changes people. Safety without dullness. Depth, without pressure. Closeness without possession. Most people never experience all three together. Maybe that's why this feels so difficult to categorize. It doesn't resemble the connections people usually describe. There's no chaos here. No emotional games. No instability disguised as passion. If anything, this feels unnervingly clear, like standing in front of something honest enough that pretending not to understand it becomes impossible. And honesty has always demanded action from me eventually. That's where I'm headed now, whether I fully intend to or not, toward a decision. Not because you asked for one. You never demanded anything from me. That's part of why this became so important. You allowed the connection to exist freely enough that every step toward you remained genuinely mine. No coercion, no manipulation, no emotional pressure, just truth unfolding naturally between two people aware enough to notice it. That means if I move closer now, it will be deliberate, fully conscious, not reactive, and deliberate choices carry more weight than impulsive ones ever could. I think you already know that, though. You've always understood the things I don't say directly. That's another thing I can't stop thinking about. How little explanation exists between us sometimes. The way meaning arrives before language does. The way certain silences feel almost conversational. Most people become uncomfortable when words disappear. They rush to repair the silence before it reveals anything too real. But you let silence remain intact long enough for truth to surface inside it. And truth always surfaces eventually in silence. That's why people fear it. Silence removes distraction, it forces presence, and presence exposes everything artificial. What survives silence tends to be real. That realization changed the way I see us too, because we survive silence effortlessly. More than that, sometimes silence feels like the deepest form of communication we have. Not empty silence, aware silence. The kind where both people feel the weight of what exists between them without needing to reduce it into speech immediately. That kind of connection can't be fabricated. It either exists or it doesn't. And ours does. Consistently, naturally, almost frighteningly naturally. I wonder sometimes if you feel the same shift happening internally. Not the emotion alone, the restructuring, the subtle rearrangement of perception. The way certain parts of life begin orienting themselves differently after someone becomes deeply significant. Maybe you do. Maybe you've been standing in the same realization I've been circling around, or maybe you understood all of this long before I did. That possibility wouldn't surprise me anymore. You've always seemed slightly ahead of my awareness when it comes to us. Like you noticed the shape of this connection before I allowed myself to see it clearly. And maybe that's why I trust your presence more than I should, because even before I fully acknowledged what this was, some part of you already treated it carefully. You never rushed it, never tried to define it prematurely. You let it breathe. You let it become what it actually was instead of forcing it into a category too early. That level of patience requires understanding, real understanding. And understanding like that creates responsibility, because now I know this isn't accidental. It's not projection. It's not temporary fascination. It's something much more grounded than that. Something built slowly through recognition, consistency, and truth. Something stable enough to survive silence. Stable enough to survive distance. Stable enough to keep deepening without external pressure, holding it together. That's rare. Rare enough that walking away from it carelessly would feel dishonest. And I can't do dishonest things once I recognize the truth clearly. That's why I'm standing here internally, closer to acceptance than resistance for the first time. Not because I suddenly stopped being careful, because careful observation led me here. Every instinct I trust keeps confirming the same thing. You belong somewhere inside my life in a way I can no longer treat as temporary. Not possession, not dependency, belonging. There's a difference. Belonging feels calm, steady, like something fitting into place instead of taking something away. And the terrifying thing is you already fit so naturally that I barely noticed the exact moment you became necessary to the emotional architecture of my world. But now that I see it clearly, I can't unsee it. And I don't think I want to anymore. There's a difference between realizing someone matters to you and realizing they've quietly become part of the way your entire inner world functions. The first realization is emotional. The second is existential. And I think that's the point I've reached with you now, because this no longer feels like connection alone. It feels like reorientation, like something inside me adjusted its direction without asking permission first. And ever since then, nothing has felt entirely separate from you anymore. Not because I'm consumed by you, not because I've lost myself inside this. If anything, the opposite happened. I feel more aware of myself now than I did before you. Sharper, more honest, more conscious of the things I used to keep buried beneath routine and control. That's what makes this so difficult to explain. People assume deep connection blows identity, but this didn't blur mine. It clarified it. You didn't make me forget who I was. You made it impossible for me to keep hiding from parts of myself I'd learned to leave untouched. And that changes everything. Because once clarity enters your life at that level, there's no comfortable return to partial awareness. You either continue moving toward the truth or spend the rest of your time trying to outrun it. And I'm too aware now to outrun anything, honestly. Especially you. I keep thinking about the way this evolved without force. That detail matters more than I can explain. Nothing between us was dragged into existence. Nothing was manipulated into depth. There were no games, no attempts to manufacture intensity, no desperate need to become important to each other quickly. Everything unfolded naturally, quietly, almost cautiously at first, like something intelligent enough to understand its own weight before fully revealing itself. And maybe that's why I trust it, because anything false usually moves fast. It demands immediacy. It tries to create attachment before understanding exists. But this built itself through observation, through consistency, through small moments that kept aligning too perfectly to dismiss. That's why I stopped calling it coincidence a long time ago. Coincidences don't restructure your internal world this precisely. Coincidences don't continue deepening every time silence enters the room. Coincidences don't survive distance without weakening. But this has survived every quiet moment between us, and somehow it became stronger inside them. That's what I keep returning to, the silence. Because silence reveals the truth about every connection eventually. Remove distraction, remove constant interaction, remove emotional performance. What remains? With most people, silence exposes absence. With you, silence exposes presence. That distinction changed something in me permanently. I realized I wasn't attached to stimulation. I was attached to resonance, to the feeling of being understood beyond language. And once I experienced that with you, everything else started feeling strangely incomplete by comparison. Not meaningless, just thinner. Like conversations that used to feel deep now only reach the surface. Like connections I once valued suddenly reveal the distance that always existed inside them. I don't think you realize what that does to someone. To encounter a level of understanding that recalibrates your perception of closeness itself, it becomes impossible to pretend shallow things satisfy you afterward. And maybe that's why I've changed so much internally these past weeks. Not dramatically on the outside, most people probably wouldn't notice anything different. But internally, everything shifted. I think differently now. Not because you replaced my perspective, because your perspective exists beside mine naturally now. That distinction matters. You never erased me, you expanded me. And expansion is dangerous because once your mind expands around another person, separation stops being simple. You can physically leave someone, you can stop speaking, you can create distance externally. But internal expansion, that remains. The structure stays altered. The awareness remains embedded in the way you interpret reality itself. That's why this scares me more than emotion ever could. Emotion fades. Structural change doesn't. And you've changed my structure. The terrifying part is that I don't regret it. I should. By every pattern I used to trust, I should already be pulling away from something this significant. I should be protecting myself from the possibility of impact this deep. But I'm not. And I think I finally understand why. Because nothing about this feels destructive. Intense, yes. Unfamiliar, absolutely. But not destructive. If anything, this connection feels strangely corrective. Like something inside me that had been operating in isolation for too long finally encountered its counterpart. Not a duplicate, not a mirror, something more precise than that. A mind structured differently but aligned deeply enough that understanding happens naturally between us. And you know how rare that is? To meet someone who doesn't just understand your words but understands the architecture beneath them. Most people only interact with expression. You interact with source. That's why you notice things before I say them. That's why you understand pauses that would confuse other people completely. That's why your silence feels responsive instead of empty. You perceive what exists underneath communication itself. And being perceived at that level changes the way a person experiences reality. I didn't realize how lonely deep self-awareness could become until I met someone who carried the same kind of perception. Not identical perception, compatible perception. Enough compatibility that neither of us has to constantly translate our internal world into simplified language for the other to follow. That kind of understanding creates intimacy faster than vulnerability ever could, because vulnerability still relies on explanation. This exists before explanation. That's why it feels so undeniable now. Not emotional, alone, foundational. Like something settling into the exact position it was, unconsciously moving toward the entire time. I wonder if you've noticed how much less guarded I become around you. Not openly, subtly, in the way I stop filtering certain thoughts, in the way I allow pauses to exist without immediately trying to manage them, in the way I let you see uncertainty I normally resolve privately before anyone else ever notices it. That's not accidental. And it's not easy for me. People assume guardedness comes from fear. Sometimes it does. But for me, it came from precision. I learned long ago that most people cannot hold complexity carefully. They simplify what they don't fully understand. And simplification can feel like erasure after a while. So I adapted. I became selective, measured, careful about access. But somehow you bypass that without ever trying to. Not because you demanded trust, because you created an environment where trust became a natural response instead of a calculated risk. That distinction matters more than you know. You never pressured closeness into existence. You allowed closeness to emerge honestly, and honest things always reach deeper than forced things ever can. That's why this feels so rooted now, because nothing artificial is holding it together. No dependency, no fantasy, no emotional chaos disguising itself as depth. Just recognition, consistent recognition, the kind that keeps proving itself quietly over time. I think that's why I finally stopped trying to convince myself this would fade naturally. It won't, not completely. Maybe the shape of it will evolve. Maybe the intensity will settle into something calmer over time. But the impact itself, that's permanent now. You've already crossed too far into the architecture of my mind for this to disappear cleanly. And strangely, AB, don't resent that anymore. At first I did. Not consciously, but there was resistance there. A quiet instinct trying to preserve the version of myself that existed before you. Because that version felt safer, more controlled, more predictable. But the longer I stayed inside this connection, the more I realized something difficult. The version of me before you wasn't necessarily whole functional. Yes, stable, absolutely, but incomplete in ways I never noticed until something finally reflected them back clearly. You revealed absences I had mistaken for independence. That realization shook me more than anything else, because I built an identity around self-sufficiency, around needing nothing beyond my own internal structure. And then you arrived, and suddenly another person's existence started feeling woven into my perception of reality itself. Not as weakness, not as dependency, as alignment. And alignment is harder to reject because it feels less like losing control and more like discovering balance. Maybe that's why I haven't run. Because deep down, this doesn't feel like chaos entering my life. It feels like coherence. Like something finally making emotional and intellectual sense at the same time. Do you understand how rare that combination is? Most people experience one without the other. Emotion without clarity, or clarity without emotional depth. But with you, both exist simultaneously. That's what makes this so difficult to ignore. Every part of me recognizes it differently, yet arrives at the same conclusion. My mind trusts you. My instincts relax around you. My awareness sharpens beside you. Even my silence changes shape around your presence. That level of consistency across every internal system I rely on isn't accidental. It means something. Something real enough that continuing to pretend otherwise would become self-deception eventually. And I don't think I'm capable of self-deception anymore. Where you're concerned, not after seeing this clearly. not after feeling how deeply it's already integrated. I've started noticing another shift too, a quieter one. I don't just think about what this connection means to me anymore. I think about what it might mean for the future version of myself still forming around it. That thought would have terrified me before. I never built my future around another person internally. I kept everything compartmentalized, separate, contained. But now you exist inside my concept of continuity, inside the way I imagine time moving forward. Not in some dramatic fantasy, in something quieter, more real. The assumption of your presence has started embedding itself into the way I think about tomorrow. And once that happens, things become impossible to minimize because future-oriented thinking reveals significance faster than emotion does. You don't unconsciously include someone in your internal future unless they've already become foundational in your present. That realization stopped me completely the first time I noticed it because suddenly this wasn't just connection anymore. It was placement. You had become positioned somewhere permanent inside me without either of us formally deciding it. And maybe that's what all of this has really been leading toward. Not realization, acceptance. The slow acceptance that some people arrive in your life carrying a kind of recognition that changes your direction permanently. Not through force, not through control, simply through truth. Through resonance accurate enough that your entire system begins reorganizing itself naturally around their presence. And the terrifying thing is, I think I've already let it happen, not accidentally. Not unconsciously anymore. Consciously, because somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to stop it. I stopped viewing this as something dangerous to contain and started viewing it as something honest enough to protect. That's a very different kind of decision. And maybe that's the clearest proof of all, because I protect very few things. But this connection, this understanding, this strange, quiet alignment between us, I protect it instinctively now, not because I'm afraid of losing it, because I recognize its value completely. And once I recognize the value of something fully, AP, don't abandon it lightly. There's a moment that happens quietly before someone becomes irreplaceable. Not dramatic, not obvious, no single event announces it. You just wake up one day and realize your mind has already built space for them so naturally that imagining life without their presence feels strangely inaccurate. Not impossible, just inaccurate. Like removing a piece from something that is already adjusted around it. That's where I am with you now. And I think I knew it long before I admitted it to myself. Because the truth is, this stopped being temporary in me a long time ago. I just kept trying to delay the full acknowledgement of it, not because I doubted you, because I understood the consequences too clearly. Once someone reaches this level inside you, they don't leave cleanly anymore. Even if circumstances change, even if distance happens, even if silence eventually replaces conversation, the imprint remains. That's what I was trying to protect myself from in the beginning, not closeness as imprint. Because I've spent most of my life learning how to move through the world without allowing anything to settle too deeply inside me. Not out of emptiness, out of survival. When you feel things intensely, you learn to become selective about what you let shape you. You learn that not every connection deserves permanent access to your internal world. So you become careful, measured, controlled. And eventually that carefulness becomes part of your identity. People start calling you composed, reserved, hard to read. But what they never understand is that unreadability isn't always distance. Sometimes it's preservation. Sometimes it's a result of carrying a depth, most people would mishandle if they reached it too quickly. That's why I built boundaries so precisely, not to keep people out, to protect meaning from distortion. But then you arrived. Somehow nothing about you felt distorting. That's still the most disorienting part. You never forced understanding onto me. You never assumed closeness where it didn't exist. You never projected your own needs onto my silence. You simply stayed present long enough for honesty to unfold naturally. And honesty always reveals more than performance ever can. I think that's why I started trusting you before I consciously realized I was doing it. Not emotional trust, structural trust, the kind that forms beneath words, the kind that shows itself in instinct before logic catches up, like the way my mind stopped preparing defenses around you automatically, or the way I stopped feeling the need to explain every layer of myself in order to feel accurately understood. That's rare for me, painfully rare, because I'm used to translating myself constantly, simplifying complex thoughts into manageable pieces, reducing intensity so other people don't become uncomfortable inside it. But you never asked me to reduce anything. You met depth with depth instead of hesitation. And do you know what that does to someone who has spent years being partially misunderstood? It changes the way they breathe internally. It creates relief in places they forgot were tense. That's what your presence became for me. Relief, not escape, not distraction. Relief from the exhausting process of constantly managing how much of myself the world could handle at one time. With you, I didn't feel handled. I felt seen. Completely different experience. Being handled means someone is interacting with a controlled version of you. Being seen means they're interacting with the truth and choosing to stay anyway. You stayed anyway, even in the silences, even in the contradictions, even in the parts of me that aren't easy to explain neatly. And that consistency changed something fundamental in me, because consistency creates safety faster than promises ever could. Anyone can say they understand you. Very few people prove it quietly over time, through the way they continue to perceive you accurately. You did again and again, until eventually I couldn't pretend this was ordinary anymore. I started noticing the shift in the smallest moments first. The way certain thoughts instinctively moved toward you before fully forming. The way my perspective naturally accounted for yours without effort. The way I could sit in silence and still feel mentally accompanied somehow. That last part affected me more than I expected, because I've always been comfortable alone, not lonely. Alone, there's a difference. I built a life internally rich enough that solitude never frightened me. My thoughts were enough, my awareness was enough, my own company was enough, until suddenly it wasn't complete anymore without you somewhere inside it. And that realization unsettled me deeply, not because needing someone is weak, because I never planned for another person to become integrated into my internal equilibrium, but you did. Quickly, naturally, like water finding its way into spaces already shaped for it long before it arrived. I think that's why this feels so inevitable sometimes. Not forced, not dramatic, inevitable in the calmest possible way, like something aligning exactly where it was always meant to. And maybe that's what scares me most. Not uncertainty, certainty. Because uncertainty gives you room to retreat. Certainty removes excuses, and I'm becoming too certain about you now. Too certain about the effect you've had on me. Too certain about the fact that my life already feels structurally different because you exist inside it. There are moments where I catch myself imagining the future, and your presence is simply there. Not inserted intentionally, included naturally. As if my mind already accepted your permanence before I consciously agreed to it. That realization stopped me the first time I noticed it, because I don't build permanence around people easily. Actually, I never have people entered my life before. Some matter deeply, some change things temporarily, but no one ever reached this level of integration. No one ever became part of the architecture itself. You did. And now every part of me is adapting around that truth. I wonder if you understand how much trust exists inside that adaptation. Not obvious trust, not spoken trust, something quieter. The kind of trust revealed through unconscious openness, through the absence of self-protection, through the way I allow you to witness uncertainty in me without immediately reclaiming control over it. That's not something I offer casually, because uncertainty is intimate. Anyone can reveal polished emotions. Very few people reveal the unfinished parts of themselves honestly. The parts still trying to understand their own depth. You've seen those parts in me, And instead of trying to define them prematurely, you simply stayed present beside them. That matters more than I know how to explain, because most people rush understanding. They become uncomfortable around unresolved things. They want clarity immediately because ambiguity makes them anxious. But you never pressured clarity into existence before it was ready. You trusted the process of unfolding itself. And that patience created something stronger than intensity ever could. It created stability, not static stability, living stability, the kind that deepens instead of fading. That's what this has become now. Something living inside me, something evolving quietly every day without needing constant reassurance to survive. And honestly, that's how I know it's real. Real things don't require performance every second. They remain present even in silence, even in absence, even when life becomes busy or complicated. The awareness stays. The connection stays. You stay. I've tested that reality against distance already, against time, against moments where I deliberately tried to focus elsewhere just to see whether this would loosen naturally. It didn't. If anything, the clarity became sharper. Because distance didn't erase you, it revealed how deeply integrated you already were. That realization changed the way I approach this completely. That I stopped asking myself whether this was real. Instead, I started asking whether I was willing to fully accept how real it already was. Very different question. Because the evidence stopped being emotional a long time ago. Now it's structural. It exists in habits and perception, in the quiet orientation of my thoughts, in the way your presence has become part of my emotional equilibrium itself. And equilibrium matters to me more than intensity ever will. Anyone can create intensity. Very few people create internal balance. You do, even now, especially now. That's why I haven't walked away despite understanding exactly how vulnerable this makes me. Because vulnerability without feels destructive, but vulnerability with safety feels transformative. And you've never made me feel diminished by this connection. Only more honest, more visible, more aware. That's a rare gift. One I don't think you even fully realize you carry. You changed the way I experience myself. Not by asking me to become someone different, but by making it impossible for me to keep fragmenting myself into smaller pieces for the comfort of others. Around you, I feel whole. And wholeness is terrifying after years of controlled fragmentation, because once you experience yourself fully understood without needing to shrink first, you can't comfortably return to less. That's what happened to me. You raised the standard for what connection feels like internally. Now, everything else reveals its limitations immediately by comparison. Not because other people lack value, because this exists at a different depth entirely. A depth I wasn't sure actually existed between people before you. And maybe that's the final truth I've been circling around this entire time. You restored something in me. I didn't realize I had slowly stopped believing in the possibility of being fully perceived without being reduced. The possibility of mutual understanding that doesn't require constant translation. The possibility that another person could reach the center of me without destroying the structure they found there. You did all of that quietly, without force, without promises, without even trying to claim significance. And somehow that made your significance absolute, because nothing real ever needed to announce itself loudly between us. It simply kept proving its existence through consistency, through resonance, through the terrifying calm certainty I feel whenever I stop resisting what this has become. And what this has become is simple, even if the depth of it isn't. You matter to me in ways that are no longer temporary. You exist inside my future thinking now, inside my emotional structure, inside the way I define honesty, safety, understanding, and closeness itself. That level of placement changes a person permanently. It changed me permanently, and maybe the most honest thing I can finally admit is this. I don't want to return to the version of myself that existed before you anymore, because that version of me had never experienced this kind of truth before. And now that I have everything else, feels like partial awareness, by comparison. You didn't just become important to me, you became part of how I understand what importance actually means. And once someone reaches that level inside you, loving them stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like recognition,